These lectures are not designed for use as medical references to diagnose, treat, or prevent medical or mental health illnesses or trauma. If you have questions about the diagnosis, treatment, or prevention of a medical condition or mental illness, you should consult your personal physician or other mental health professional.
My first job was as a busboy at the Opryland theme park near Nashville, Tennessee. Now, being Opryland, it was all about country music and the Grand Ole Opry, both of which tap into deep musical roots and often stir up a lot of emotions. My job was less glamorous, but I recall a few little tricks we used to use to manage customers' emotions. First, there was a peg puzzle on the table. Keep them distracted and they'll forget how long they've been waiting for their food. We also had tabletop jukeboxes, more distraction, and one rather goofy but fun attraction. Each table had a chubby cow on it. And when you turned the cow over, it made a very low but hilarious moo sound. At any given time, I could pause and hear a chorus of moos all around the restaurant. People thought it was hilarious, and it boosted their mood. I wonder if it also boosted their estimation of the quality of the food and the service. I'm not sure, but we were no doubt regulating their emotions. Welcome to our lecture on emotions and emotion regulation, two phenomena so common, so ever-present, that we might not even notice they are there. But our emotions influence everything, including how we think and what we do. The classic joke goes something like this. Two fish are happily swimming along in the water. One fish turns to the other and says, "Hey man, how's the water?" The other fish, looking baffled, answers, "Water? What water?" Whether we feel expert or unskilled, we are all emotional artists working in a complex media. We need to learn to appreciate nuance, learn to blend, and learn to regulate our emotions as best we can. But what happens when things go wrong and our emotions are unregulated? We see things like depression, anxiety, stress, or neuroticism. Remember that dysphoria isn't the enemy when it has something to tell us, but there's really no value in allowing negative emotions to go unchecked. Let's step back and review emotions and then see what we can do about them. So, what are emotions? Well, emotions communicate information about relationships to the self and the world. They're sort of like a global weather report. They can either motivate us to withdraw from something or someone, or to approach something or someone. They're very much influenced by learning and by memory. Emotions are body-based and they're phylogenetically old. They emerge developmentally, early in life really, and some would even say that they're hardwired. We know that blind infants make facial expressions that match the emotion that they happen to be feeling. Remember our CBT triangle, where we have emotions on one corner, thoughts and behavior on the other two corners. If we want to understand our emotions, we'll look at the thoughts and we'll look at the behaviors. So what's the meaning of some of our primary emotions? And before, we've talked about the cognitive themes around emotions. So for anger, it's usually something about a perceived violation, an injustice, or a frustration of a wish or a desire. For happiness, it's often the perception or the expectation of gain. Anxiety or fear is often about the perception of threat or danger or difficulty with coping. Sadness is usually about the perception of loss or something that will be lost, either real or symbolic. Knowing these themes or meanings may help us use emotional information, but there are a number of steps we'll need to take. First, we need to be able to perceive and correctly identify the emotion. This might include physical, cognitive, or behavioral cues. Second, we need to know the trigger for that emotion. Was it internal or external? Was it real or imagined? Was it in the present moment or a memory of things past? Although these two steps might seem simple, they may not be, depending on your emotional style. Think about the three primary cases we've been following. Miriam, an older widow who recently lost her mother. Amanda, a woman in her mid-20s who's searching for a job and struggling with mild depression. And David, who had a recurrence of colon cancer. Three different people with three different emotional styles. Miriam's emotions are powerful and are right on the surface. She bursts into tears when she begins thinking about her mother. She exerts a lot of energy trying to suppress her emotions. David, well, he's kind of the opposite. He's terminally ill, but his emotions are more deeply buried. He's practical and sensible and stereotypically male when it comes to expressing his feelings. Keep your chin up. Be tough. David will have far more trouble recognizing the sensation of an emotion in his body and then correctly identifying it. For someone like David, I would probably spend some time helping him learn emotion words and pairing those words with sensations. I would literally have a chart with emotion words paired with facial expressions and bodily sensations. The next step would be identifying the trigger. Again, Miriam is probably going to be a little ahead of David, but her challenge will be to see the layers underneath her sadness. She's not just sad. She's also stressed and anxious and disappointed, and she feels guilty. So step one is identifying the emotion, and step two is identifying the trigger. You might try doing this on your own for a few days. Be more aware of muscle tension. Look in the mirror and see how your face holds certain emotions. Notice what your stomach does. Notice what happens to your energy levels. Although the trigger usually happens first, we're most likely to notice the emotion, and then we can backtrack to figure out the trigger. Try adding a few pages on this to your journal. Once you've identified the emotion and its trigger, you've reached the interpretive step. Understanding the themes associated with emotions might help you understand just what's going on. Write down the associated cognitions. What are the thoughts that go along with this theme? And remember that there are likely to be associated behaviors too. Back to the CBT triangle. Depression or sadness is usually associated with inactivity, which is still a behavior. It might also include rumination and social withdrawal, or just sleeping a lot more. Anxiety usually triggers avoidance and safety-seeking behaviors. Happiness and joy are activating and help us lower our walls and more fully engage in activities with others. So capture the emotion, the trigger, the associated cognitions, and any linked behaviors. These are all part of your basic CBT tools related to self-monitoring and interpretation, and they also might just fit really nicely in a 7-column thought record. So now that you have the data, what's next? The next step is deciding if you need to or want to regulate the emotions you're having. And here we go back to the hurtful versus helpful distinction. Now, feeling dysphoria or distress isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it can be helpful. But being stuck with excessive distress is something that you might want to change. Recall that all of our CBT tools target emotion regulation and/or functioning to some degree, so really any of our tools thus far might do the trick. But before you start testing out tools, let's take a closer look at our emotional instruments because our emotions are complex and vary greatly across people. It behooves each of us to develop a deep understanding of our emotional habits. Are you easily angered? Are you typically anxious? Are you mostly a happy-go-lucky person? Are you more of a Miriam or are you more of a David? Let's introduce a model that helps us slow down and better understand how an emotional response gets evoked. It's called the modal model of emotions. Let's watch the next clip and see how this works. But let's talk a little bit about something first called the modal model of emotion. And this helps us to understand really a series of events that cause us to have an emotional response. And if you understand all the links in the chain, you can think about different strategies that target those links in a chain. It gives you just different opportunities to begin to understand and to manage the emotions you have. So for the modal model of emotion, we have a situation. So you're talking with your wife, you're at the doctor's, you're stuck in traffic, or whatever it might be. There's a situation that you find yourself in. In that situation, you're paying attention to something. You know, you can be in a negative situation, but if your mind is somewhere else, it's probably not going to affect you that much. So you need the situation to happen. You need to be paying attention to something in that situation. Then there's an appraisal. That's the cognitive part. So it's not just what happens and what you're paying attention to, it's what sorts of meaning do you give to it. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Did that person cut you off on purpose? So it's how you think about the situation. And that ultimately helps us to understand the emotional reaction. So situation, attention, appraisal, and then the emotional reaction. If your goal, though, is to feel less anxious or less angry or less worried, you want to look at different scenarios where this has happened and think about which strategy, which emotion regulation strategy would be most helpful. For the situation, you can select pre-select the kind of situation you're going to be in. If you know that going to visit, say, your in-laws is going to stir up a lot of frustration and anxiety, then you can maybe choose not to go on that particular visit. If you want to modify the situation, that's sort of your next strategy, you can make sure that you go at a time of day when you know you have the most energy and the most patience and the most mood. If you know you feel uncomfortable going to see a particular doctor because they talk too fast or there's too much information, you can modify the situation by bringing your wife with you or someone with you that can jot down notes for you so you don't have to worry so much about missing something. So first strategies to regulate emotion: situation selection or situation modification. Again, walking down that chain, you're going to be paying attention, and if paying attention is causing you to stir up those feelings, you can use distraction or what's called attentional deployment. So if you're sitting in traffic and you're just feeling frustrated at all this traffic, you can turn on the radio, you can listen to a podcast. There are things you can do to move your mind elsewhere so that it's not getting under your skin so much. Keep going down that chain, you get to appraisal, and that's where we do thought records or cognitive reappraisals. Someone cuts you off in traffic, you have the automatic thought, oh man, what a jerk, he totally did that on purpose. You can sort of put the brakes on that thought and go, everybody's trying to get home, they're probably being a little bit thoughtless and not entirely generous. That's the way that traffic works. Oftentimes, I've probably done it before too. So you're putting the brakes on, taking a step back and reappraising the situation so it has a little bit less of a charge to it. And if you haven't stopped the emotion through all those chains and you still get to that emotional reaction, we've talked about relaxation strategies, breathing strategies, there's emotional suppression, kind of put it on a back shelf, or there's different ways to express emotions that are hopefully more constructive than others. So let me pause there and see if you have any questions either about the modal model of emotion, those links in a chain, or these different emotion regulation strategies.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's laid out pretty well. I honestly kind of wish I'd known this decades ago. It seems to be, I think one of the things is even reaching the end, where the emotion comes up and realizing even if I've sort of skipped these steps a little bit in the earlier part, to realize that yes, okay, I've hit this spot now, I need to do something. I don't want to be in this emotional upset. So taking a deep breath or those kinds of things can just get me out of that. But the earlier steps are very interesting because I could fend it off before I even get to that spot.
Exactly. So what did we just see and why does it matter? Well, David is learning some basic foundational knowledge about the modal model of emotions. In a way, he's having an aha experience. He's already looking ahead to potential points on that continuum where he might use some tools. Let's see where he goes with this in this next clip. So I know this is a little theoretical and a little abstract, so why don't we think of a specific example? So in the past week, something that's recent, can you think of a situation where a negative emotion was activated for you? And we'll see if we can walk through these steps together.
Yeah, I was speaking with my son on the phone, and he seems sometimes so selfish to me.
Okay, selfish.
And he's never really grown up is a big part of the problem.
Yeah.
Although I know that a lot of that is how I feel about it, all the years we've spent together, and I have my own baggage that goes with my conversations with him.
Yeah.
But somehow in this time in my life when I'm looking, kind of facing my death, so to speak, it's like I want people to treat me different, and maybe that's really selfish. And so I get wrapped up in this whole conversation with him, and there's all this old stuff that goes with it.
Sure.
And I find myself getting upset with him.
Yeah.
And it's just the conversation that we're having. It's not even necessarily his fault, but how I think about it. But
right. So I think we've come through the different chains, and we'll go back and visit each of these. But what's the emotional reaction? You said upset, but that's kind of a generic word. Is it angry or
a bit angry and
disappointed?
and Yeah, certainly some disappointment, and it's like, after all these years, you're still, acting like you're 12. You know what I mean? And yeah, there's a lot of emotions. They kind of all come together. I think, anger itself can be a mishmash of a lot of different stuff,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure I could pinpoint exactly how each one goes together, but.
Okay, so let's just fit this into the model and see if it works. So the situation is you're on the phone talking with your son. So we don't have to shade it any particular color, make any assumptions. You're on the phone talking with your son. You're paying attention to the conversation, so you're not watching TV or surfing on the internet or whatever. So we have the attention part that's there. Sounds like there's some appraisals that are going on. He says something like. You think of something he said or approximate something he said?
Well, yeah, I mean, he's kind of trying to, micromanage me and, Dad, you gotta, blah, blah, blah. And he gets into these things sometimes. And I'll go, look, there's a lot you need to learn, son, and then the conversation just kind of goes into this whole direction that it always has taken. It's sort of circular.
So it sounds like he's telling you what to do. You said micromanage, so he's kind of telling you what to do and how to manage your life or your doctor's appointments.
Yeah, he thinks he knows more than I do. It's like I'm going to tell him, like, hey, I've been around a lot longer than you have.
Yeah, okay. So some irritation there, feeling a little controlled by him. And you mentioned the reaction was sort of anger and disappointment and frustration. So here we're helping him apply the model to a real-world example. This is where I'll be able to see if he really gets it or not. It's also a chance for him to see, in a very personal way, how this model works in his life. How would you go about using this? Now, in this next clip, David is asked to use the model to come up with some emotion regulation strategies. Where do you think that he should go with this next? So if we were thinking then about how to help you regulate that emotion, I mean, we could change the situation, right? So.
Right, I think I could start with saying, I'm not up for this conversation right now.
Okay.
I don't feel well enough. We should try it again some other time, or just can we talk later?
Yep.
And that would give me time actually to reassess why I keep going down this road as well.
Sure. Another example would be situation modification, where sometimes people have more positive interactions if they talk in person versus they talk over the phone. Is there something about the eye contact or just the proximity where people are, I don't know if it's more forgiving, but there's less likelihood of having a blow up? Is that something that would work for him?
I think that's true. I mean, you can read facial expressions and body language, and sometimes that helps to clarify what somebody's trying to say.
Right, so less misunderstandings that way. I know it's not always possible to meet with people in person every time you talk with them, but that's an example of a situation modification strategy. Attentional deployment, probably not a great one when you're talking with someone on the phone. If you're not going to pay attention to what they're saying, you should probably just end the phone call, right? Seems sort of so pointless, so probably not that one. Cognitive reappraisal, so he's like, Dad, you really should do this, and why don't you keep a journal of this, and why don't you do this, and why don't you do this? So what's a different way you could think about that would be less angering or less frustrating?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because in this particular situation, again, I have to go back to the baggage that we've had over the years, and it's really like where I really need to reassess how I'm viewing the conversation going, and having to take myself out of my normal, I usually go down this road in the conversation, change it up.
Right, so we know where the well-worn paths go, and we know the end of that path is feeling angry and disconnected and frustrated, and so we want to create a different path for you, and by different path, a different way of thinking about a common type of conversation that you have. So the well-worn path seems to be, he's controlling me, he's not respecting my experience, he's overstepping his bounds, or whatever. I'm putting thoughts in your head, but it seems like that's sort of the types of thoughts that come up. A cognitive reappraisal would be something like, he has the best of intentions, even if his delivery needs a little improvement. He's staying on the phone with me because he's genuinely trying to help. He may not know the words that I need to hear from him, but he's at least on the phone, right? The other kids are off doing their things and they didn't call you. So, I mean, there are different ways to validly think about the same sort of situation that are maybe more helpful in terms of the emotional reaction. The other way to think about that is, it's not appraisals, but it's thinking about sort of conflict negotiation, and you probably want to do that in person, and it's sitting down and having a conversation with him and saying, hey, let's talk about this, and when we're on the phone, because I want us to have positive conversations. I want you to feel heard, and I want to feel heard as well. So let's talk about how to move forward. And I don't know him, I don't know what he'll say or what his perspective would be, but it gives you an opportunity, sort of a working space, right, for both of you to try to behave differently, to have a different kind of conversation and see where that goes.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the basic model. So remember, on the left-hand side, we have the situation, followed by paying attention in that situation, your cognitions or appraisals of the situation, followed eventually by your emotional response. Note the similarities to the CBT model of the situation, automatic thought, and emotional response. Now let's go back and add in regulation opportunities based on that model. First, we have situation selection and situation modification. We might also deploy our attention in a different direction or use distraction techniques. We might use cognitive strategies like reappraisals, and this is exactly what David did. We might also try somatic quieting or other post hoc response strategies to mitigate or to at least reduce our emotional reactions. So where does this leave us with the toolbox? In this lecture, we essentially started with the end goal, regulating emotions, and worked our way backwards. Along the way, we were able to use our foundational CBT knowledge and tools, namely self-monitoring and interpretation. We were then able to use the modal model of emotion to see where behavioral strategies like somatic quieting or attentional deployment, really distraction, fit in. We were also able to take out some of our cognitive tools of reappraisals, think thought records, so that we could interpret situations differently and thus have a different emotional response. It's really the same set of tools we've been using, but now applied to a model of emotions. So now you should be able to start at the bottom with the basic CBT tools and work your way up, or start at the top with emotion regulation and work your way down. In subsequent lectures, we'll start with interpersonal relationships, our second primary outcome goal, and work our way down, particularly regarding sensitivity to interpersonal rejection. Another way to conceptualize emotion regulation skills and the ability to perceive and understand emotions is an idea called emotional intelligence. Now, there's a lot of debate about what it means and what it truly predicts, but let me share my favorite model that frames EQ as an ability that can be learned. The model I used was developed by Mayer, Salovey, and Caruso during their time together at Yale University. Now, they define EQ as the ability to perceive and express emotion, assimilate emotion and thought, understand and reason with emotion, and to regulate emotion in the self and others. You can think of perception, understanding, and reasoning as our foundational skills, and emotion regulation as an advanced skill. In this model, emotion regulation is conceptualized as the process of shaping which emotions one has, when one has them, and how one experiences or expresses emotions. Now, they aren't cognitive therapists, but a lot of what they talk about falls squarely into CBT territory. What I like most about this model is that it's hopeful. It tells us that we can get better at perceiving emotions, better at understanding emotions, and better at regulating emotions. So how can we learn to get better? SEL, or socio-emotional learning programs, have become a staple in most schools. Kids are learning early on about emotions and about EQ. But what about for us adults? Here's an example of a CBT-based program from the University of Pennsylvania. The program was developed by Karen Rivich, a psychologist trained in CBT and positive psychology. The positive psychology curriculum she co-developed and leads teaches us how to overcome the emotional effects of negative events by using 7 core principles. And as I read through these 7 principles, I want you to think about your CBT toolbox. So first is improving emotion awareness and control. Second, improving our impulse control. Third, learning realistic optimism. Fourth, increasing our ability to think flexibly. 5, building self-efficacy or self-confidence. 6, developing empathy for others. And 7, reaching out to our social supports or just reaching out to connect. It's a useful exercise to take this list of 7 core ideas and cross-translate them to our CBT toolbox. For example, impulse control can be achieved through somatic quieting and challenging the beliefs about not acting. Flexible thinking falls squarely into the habits of mind and using our thought records. I hope you're seeing the point that the tools you have are truly foundational. They can get repackaged and renamed a bit, but you have the core skills in your toolbox to use at your discretion. We've mostly been thinking about how to regulate emotions in ourselves, but it's important that we also think about how we might go about regulating emotions in others. Although regulation might sound somewhat cold and calculating, it can and often does include warmth, empathy, and kindness. Since this often comes up, I want to say a word on personal responsibility. In most Western industrialized society, we value individualism. Pick yourself up by your bootstraps. A pioneer is supposed to be strong and not burden others. In more collective cultures, like, say, Japan or China, all people are seen as interdependent. Your problem or your mood affect me and is also my shared responsibility. When I talk of regulating emotions in others, it isn't to say you're responsible for others. It's really just to acknowledge that we live in a social world and often have to interact with others both at work and at home. We need a skill set to help us deal with emotions that inevitably come up. You can still be an individualist or a collectivist, but you'll need the skill set nonetheless. We should also consider contextual learning. One of the important features of emotions is that they help us learn about a situation. If you're constantly stepping in to soothe another person's emotions, you may be limiting their opportunities to learn, or you may be reinforcing their insecurities. For example, if you always come to the rescue of an anxious person, you may teach them that they're vulnerable and weak on their own. If you're constantly covering for and bolstering the mood of a family member who drinks too much, you might be facilitating his or her addiction. Again, I would encourage you to think of this more as tools in your toolbox. You'll still have to carefully consider when and where and with whom to use them. We can think of emotion regulation as either antecedent-focused, change it before it happens, or as response modulation, doing something to ease the sting, the response, after it's occurred. Let's run through the modal model of emotion and think about our strategies as they might apply to emotion regulation in others. Let's start with situation selection when managing emotions in others. Strategies in this category might include scheduling time to talk, scheduling pleasant activities, or scheduling time to work on a project together. For some of my anxious patients, their significant others will do initial exposure exercises with them as a way to help them get started. With kids, we manage their situations all the time. Where they go, what they do, who they do it with. If needed, we can do this to some extent with friends and family. I know exactly who I can and cannot invite to the same dinner party. I'm managing the situation before an emotion occurs. Situation modification is similar to when we manage our own emotions. We might help others by making sure we only give them feedback in private or put down our cell phones when they really need us to listen. We change situational circumstances in order to send an important emotion-regulating nonverbal signal. What about attentional deployment? If you know someone has had a bad event happen and they're prone to rumination, you can serve as a high-bandwidth distraction. Take them out. Call them. Absorb their attention to take their mind elsewhere. Suggest activities that might not only distract them, but will improve their mood. Cognitive strategies are usually directed inward, as you're really the only one that has access to your cognitions and appraisals. However, you can use those same CBT skills to first manage your emotions so that you're in a better place to manage someone else that might be in a lot of distress. Once you have your equanimity, you're better able to help someone else. Sort of like when the airlines tell you to put on your oxygen mask first, before you help your child. You can also use your cognitive skills to guide conversation, after you ask what would be most helpful. Sometimes folks want input and guidance, and other times they just need someone to listen or just to be around. And finally, remember that oftentimes you can implicitly serve as a piece of counter-evidence. If someone feels rejected and unloved, you prove otherwise when you accept them and you love them. If someone feels unheard and disrespected, you validate them when you listen and give them respect. It may be subtle, and they may not notice it right away, but we all have the power to change hearts and minds simply by how we behave towards others. Okay, so let's go back to our CBT toolbox and see what we have. We've listed emotion regulation as a proximal target of all the skills since Lecture 1. It's where we're trying to get to. We've mostly focused on both cognitive and behavioral strategies. Today, we started at the top with emotions, unpacked their meaning, and added to some foundational knowledge that might help us be better regulators. We learned a new model, the modal model of emotions, that helps us identify opportunities to manage emotions before they occur or to ease them after they've already happened. As a homework exercise, I would encourage you to write out the modal model and populate it with at least 2 examples of emotionally charged events from your life. Identify what was happening at each step in the model. Next, you'll identify emotion regulation strategies. Try them out. What helped? What didn't work? In the next lecture, please join us as we talk about the practical and important skill set of problem solving. Thank you.